Thanks for coming out in the rain. We're tonight, our study is taken from the 41st chapter of Genesis. We'll be covering mostly the first part of that chapter, and then next week we'll be looking into the second part of that chapter. So we're looking at Genesis 41. We'll be looking at verses 8 through 16, verses 33 through 43. What our text kind of skips over is the details of the dream itself and the description of the dream itself, which was basically 7 cattle, fine fed cattle, and then 7 frail cattle that ate the seven fat cattle, and then 7 fresh stalks, and then 7 weak stalks, and they just ate each other. And the translation that Joseph gave was there'll be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So with that in mind, let's look at our text, beginning at verse number 8. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. This is Pharaoh. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was not one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream. In one night, he and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Then it jumps to verse 33 here. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and send him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off of his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot, which he had, and they cried out before him, Bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Observations. What do you see here?
You and I were talking earlier. The thing that spoke to me was God's timing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we know God, it's easy to say this stuff because we're on this side of the story, but I'm sure Joseph was in turmoil for 2 years, trying to figure out what was happening. And on the morning that this happened, what little bit we know about Egyptian culture, I'm sure the guards that came and got him did not tell him, hey, you're going to see Pharaoh. You know, they come and got him, they whisked him off, and next thing you know, he's standing in Pharaoh's court. And I thought it amazing that the first thing he said to Pharaoh was, it's not of me, it's of God.
Right.
I think God, as we've seen over and over again, as God had hardened Pharaoh's heart in other parts of the Bible, I think Pharaoh, I don't think the word troubled is truly indicative of what Pharaoh felt. Pharaoh felt this morning. He was in turmoil with this dream. This dream was repeated twice. It was very graphic and all that. And the fact that what spoke to me was, in God's timing, at the end of one day, it appears, Joseph went from out of a dungeon into the second chariot with orders to be bowed down to because he was over all of Egypt.
That's right. Exactly. When God's timing turned itself over and it became time, everything happened.
Like I told you earlier, we were talking, what came to my mind was Isaiah 55, 8, 9, where God says to Isaiah, your thoughts are not my thoughts. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. And then it says, as the heavens are above the earth, my thoughts are higher than yours, and my ways are higher than yours. Which it kind of roughly translates in, we don't know what good God has for us.
That's right. And we don't fully understand the process that it takes to take us there, because it's I'm sure that Joseph would have loved the express ride, wouldn't you think? I would love the express ride. In 13 years, can we break that down to 6? But it wasn't until I believe that Joseph was ready for what he was about to experience, because for him to give him what he gave him earlier than that, I believe would have been a cruel joke to Joseph. Any other observations? Yes, please.
Well, what a roller coaster ride in Joseph's life. He's the favorite of his favorite son of his father.
Mm-hmm.
His father dresses him in expensive clothing. He talks to his brothers mock him. His brothers were going to kill him, and then they said, no, let's toss him into this pit, and then they sell him into slavery. So he's in slavery, he goes to Egypt, he figures things are going to be pretty bad for him. The man that he's sold to realizes how somebody blesses Joseph.
Right.
And so Joseph is only second to Potiphar, and in many ways knows everything in the house, but Potiphar doesn't.
That's right.
He's, from being a slave to being in charge of the entire thing, and probably, even as a slave, he could come and go as he saw fit for the house business.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go into town and buy grain for bread, if that may be the case.
Yes.
And he didn't have to worry about being a slave and people thinking he was escaping or anything like that. And then something bad happened, as Potiphar's wife accused him. Then he's thrown into jail. Well, that's a bad thing too.
Yeah.
But then he's raised up in jail, but he's still in jail.
That's right. Yeah. It was quite a roller coaster ride, wasn't it? I mean, it seems like, okay, I'm getting somewhere. What? Tragedy. And these weren't just bad things happening. He didn't have a bad hair day. He was thrown in prison. He was forgotten about. He was, despised by his own family, and turned into a slave. Yeah, these were some very bad turns that took in his life. And the miraculous thing is that he turned out better than he was before. I've always said that a hard time's going to make you either better or bitter. And I see too many people who experience bad things and they turn out bitter instead of allowing that to be something that God shapes in them. Yes, Cindy.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, it makes me think of Paul. Because maybe he didn't have as much of a roller coaster situation, but you think of all the times God called him somewhere,
Oh, yes.
and then all of a sudden he gets there and there's this turmoil. You know, a lot of situations where, like, God, I thought you put me here.
Mm-hmm.
I would think as a human being, he would kind of, at the beginning, while he's maturing as a Christian, you know, as a born-again Christian, you figure that out. Like, I thought you brought me here, now I'm in prison, who am I going to minister to?
Oh, yes.
But he wrote so many of their letters there too.
Yes.
God's plan.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, he was so busy all the time, if he didn't write all those letters, we wouldn't have the New Testament.
Much of it,
Some
that's
it,
right.
Some of it.
Yeah,
Not all,
much of
I'm
it.
just saying, a lot
Yeah,
of it.
yeah.
So.
It's quite amazing.
Yeah.
You know, when Paul was converted, the first thing he did was went to Jerusalem, and then he almost got killed in Jerusalem. The apostles had to say, "Get out of here," and he had to leave. And then he went into years of isolation in Arabia, and then he ends up trying to get involved in, and he ends up back home on his Tarsus, and he's there for a long time. Same kind of holding pattern, same kind of thing. It wasn't until Barnabas come around and said, "Hey, buddy, we could use you in Antioch," that his ministry began to take root and take off. And like you said, no matter where he went on his missionary trip, sometimes he was whipped. He got whipped constantly. At one point he was stoned, thrown outside the city, and I personally believe he died there in that situation, and not just swooned as some thought. So there was a lot of that very same stuff. We see this pattern. Actually, we see this pattern a lot in the Word of God. We really do when God begins to shape and mold its leaders. Any other? James?
It's kind of speculation, but I wonder if, just looking at the whole pattern of Joseph's life and how God worked things through,
Right?
I wonder if God was trying to teach him that he shouldn't just run off on his own. Like, had he been freed at any point, he could have
Right.
been tempted to just go back home.
You're right.
You know,
You're right.
And I kind of wonder, even once he was elevated, to run Egypt, he could have been tempted, well, I'll set things in motion and then at least go visit.
Yeah.
But it seemed like God had so trained him, I guess, to accept where he was at and what position he was put in, that he didn't even seem to have any indication that he wanted to go back home at that point.
I really think that the entire process was Joseph being shaped and humbled and learning to rely more and more on God, because what he was going to ultimately do, he would have to rely just so much on God. Joseph's success wasn't because Joseph was brilliant. Joseph's success wasn't because he was educated. It wasn't because he was so great or so anointed even. It was because he had learned to hear God and learned to know what God would have. Yes.
Kind of follow up that. I thought it was really cool that Pharaoh didn't say, "This guy's brilliant, let's put him in charge." He's like, who else has the Spirit of God in him?
That's right. And we're going to look at that phrase, and I think there's something really important to notice about what Pharaoh says in response to Joseph that I think is vital to understanding exactly what happened in that chamber. Mel?
God really blessed Joseph and the food too, because they collected only 1/5 of it for
That's right.
7 years, and it lasted 7 years, and they also sold it to other countries.
Yes,
So-
yes. So it was. Yeah, he was stocking up, but it was the architectural undertaking that he understood, where he didn't cripple those 7 years, and still was able to. I do believe that there was some miraculous work there as well. I do believe God took what was there and added to it.
Because I would have thought you'd collect half. So did
You would think
do
so.
that?
You would think so. That at least you could have
Only
half a
one
year's
did.
worth of supply, don't you think? Well, obviously, that wasn't the case there.
Probably showed the abundance that they had that year.
That's right. That's right.
7 years.
Any other observations there? James, is your hand up or you're scratching the back of your neck? Okay. All right. All right. Yeah, as me and Greg was talking before our meeting this morning, one of the things to really realize and to really embrace is that morning when Joseph got up, it was not anything different from the last 2 years of his life. For 2 years, he'd gotten up, done the same routines, done some things. Might have been a good day, might have been a bad day, but more than likely it was a normal day. He went through his routines. He went through his, like Craig pointed out. No, you didn't see what was going on behind the scenes. You didn't see anything that was taking place. And when the guards come down, more than likely they didn't tell him what this was all about. You know, their orders was go get Joseph, and so they took him down, and then they took him into the washroom and just scrubbed him down and shaved him and threw him some decent clothes to wear. The next thing that you knew, because they didn't take a whole lot of time, because guess who was waiting? Pharaoh was waiting, and so they rushed him into the chamber room. There he stood in front of the most powerful man of the times. Egypt was a superpower. Egypt was the most civilized civilization in that era, in that time. It was one of the most powerful forces there. And now Joseph was standing in front of the most powerful man in the world at the time. He woke up that morning, absolutely. He woke up that morning on a stone floor. That night he laid his head in royal chambers. He woke up that morning in the rags of a prisoner. By the end of the day, he's going to be wearing a gold chain. He's going to be wearing the Pharaoh's very signet ring. He's going to be rushed around in a chariot, and the people bowing before him. Talk about a different day, right? Talk about a day where everything just turns around. And if Joseph was here tonight and he was here before you, he would say, I want to share with you two very vital principles that you need to remember when you find yourself in those prison situations, or you find yourself in those rough times and seasons. The first thing is that just because you don't see it happening, don't mean it's not happening. God is still at work. God is still doing things behind the scenes. God is still working in the king's chambers. He is still working in bringing you to that place where he desires you most to be in your life. So that would be the first principle. The second principle that I really love here, that I see here, is that God can do more in one day than you can do in a lifetime. God can do more in 1 hour than you can do in a lifetime. Something you need to realize is Joseph was not only standing before Pharaoh, he was standing before Pharaoh's court. Some of the men in that room had spent their entire fortune. They had studied all their life. They had done everything that they could do. They had stealed, killed, whatever they had to do to get in the Pharaoh's presence. And they would do anything within their power to please him, so that they could get a promotion. And then all of a sudden, this prisoner comes out of prison, stands in front of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's slipping a signet ring on his hand. He's given him everything that they've ever dreamed of. And Joseph was quick to realize something. This is not my doing. This has nothing to do with my past, other than being shaped and molded. This is a God thing in our life. And when you experience that kind of experience in your life, then you can step back and you can say, Lord, thank you. The dream has finally arrived. So we're going to look at what happens when the dream finally arrives. What happens when that dream finally makes it show in our life? Remember last week we looked at Habakkuk's word? Habakkuk 2:3 said, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. It seems like Habakkuk in the end of this is contradicting himself, right? He says, though it tarries, wait for it. Then he turns around and says, it will not tarry. What was Habakkuk talking about? I believe Habakkuk understood the intricacies of God's program and plan. There is a period of tarrying. There's a period when things wait. There's a period when there's a process that takes place in the visions and the dreams that God gives us. But when that ball starts rolling, boom, it happens, and it happens seemingly overnight. It's a suddenly experience in our life. I've seen people that God turned around their situation and the circumstance in a matter of hours, and that's exactly what he did for Joseph. That was the kind of dream that God had given to Joseph. Now, Peter tells us that it is within God's plan to exalt you. That's what Peter says. Not for your purpose, but for his. To exalt you, not so that people may applaud you and say, yeah, way to go, you're such a smart, you're such brilliant, you're such an anointed person, but so that he may receive glory in you and through you. Listen to what 1 Peter said. I love this verse. He said, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. Now, Peter points out that there's two things that are factors in your exalting. First of all, there's that humbling of yourselves under the mighty hand of God. In other words, there's that submitting your life, submitting your heart, submitting your character, submitting your attitude, submitting everything you have under God's mighty hand and under God's mighty rule there. So we need to understand that. That's a vital part. That's what Joseph has been through all this time. That's what Joseph had been through for 13 years of his life. But then he says that he may exalt you in due time. Joseph just experienced due time. Joseph just experienced that moment in your life where you are exalted. Why would God exalt you? Like I said before, you are a reflection of God. You are to be the glory of God for the world that's around about you. You are to be a reflection of what he can do, what he can accomplish, what he can be in the lives of our world. So you are that God truly has for you. In that due time, it'll be unstoppable. No matter what's going on in your life, it's also unexplainable. In that oftentimes we can't quite explain it. He couldn't put his finger on it. He couldn't say, well, it's because I did such and such. Because it's been 2 years since he interpreted this guy's dream. He realized one thing: the only explanation is this is God's doing. But one of the key things that Joseph teaches us here as well is even when it's due time, you've got to have the discerning and the courage to step through that door. You have to have the discerning and the courage to be obedient to that call, to be obedient to what you have in your life, so that you might accomplish what God has sent you to accomplish. Not what we want to accomplish, but what God has sent you to accomplish. He was standing before the most important, powerful man in the world at the time. It was his time. Somebody would say, oh, Joseph, this is your time to shine. But instead of shining, he pointed to God and said, I want you to see my God. I want you to see what God is doing and will do in your life.
And not only that, this man was a non-believer.
Yeah, absolutely.
That to me spoke, it's like, when your time comes, be prepared to give God the glory, not take it yourself.
That's it.
And because more than likely, you're going to be sharing with a non-believer. At least in my life, it seems like it's been like that.
Absolutely. And he would be a testament not just to Pharaoh, but to all of Egypt. Then ultimately he would be a testament to Jehovah God, to all of the civilized world that would come to them for them to feed them and to help them. This was a powerful, very powerful principle in their life. We have to have the courage to do what God would have for us to do. Let me ask you a question. Can God still radically change your life? Will you let God radically change your life? If all of a sudden he comes up and say, okay, I need you such and such, and backs out of nowhere doing such and such, would you let that really take place in your life? Do you have the courage to step out and say, I know this is God, I'm going to follow this, I'm going to pursue this in your life? That's the attitude that Joseph had. Yes, Rhonda.
Yeah, because when he found himself in front of Pharaoh, since he was over all of the prisoners,
Mm-hmm.
there's two choices. Either he could be exalted even more,
Oh,
or
right.
because you're over the prisoners now, you're going to be in the dungeon and you won't see anybody. There could have been,
Yes.
ultimate things there. Even though he knew his own dreams, he was, gonna be exalted, that he didn't know when.
That's right. And he didn't know, because he'd been here before, hadn't he? And he'd been here before with the dreams, where you interpret the dreams and still nothing come out of it. Nothing took place in his life. But what Joseph would come to realize almost immediately is, this is the dream I dreamed when I was a boy. Of being a ruler, of being in charge, of being above my family, above even the stars in the sky. In other words, over the kingdoms of the world around about you. So Joseph had to have that courage, and he had to have that integrity. But there's a few principles about when that dream happens in our life that I think Joseph can really teach us here. And we need to embrace those, because they're principles that I believe is recurring throughout the Word of God that we can rely upon. The very first thing that will happen to that dream is that it will mean far less to us. What? The dream, the vision that God gives you, by the time He puts it in your life, will not be the primary thing in your heart. Will not be the primary goal in your life. It will become secondary. Why? Because it's vital for it to be secondary. It's vital for it to not hold that importance. Did this dream have as much of a pull upon Joseph as it did when he was a boy? I don't think so. Because see, Joseph's eyes was only filled with, I'm going to be ruler over all you guys. He was full of ambition. It was full of his own personal pride. It was full of all these things. But by the time he receives it, it means far less in his life and his heart. By the time he gets there, God has set a very totally different set of values in Joseph's life. If God's giving you a great vision, don't think that it's going to be great by the time you receive it. Because it's going to be secondary by the time you receive it. Because that is the only way He can trust you with it. What do you mean by that, Derrick? You see, it's the only way that He can truly trust to give us what He's giving us. If He's going to give you plenty as far as financially or in that way, let me tell you, He's got to be able to trust you with money. If He's going to give you as far as success, He's got to trust you that success won't lead you astray. If He's going to give you power, He's got to be convinced that power won't, because He understands something. And that is that if you're not ready for it, it will crush you. It will destroy you. It will strip away from you. And it's nothing good that will help you if that's the case. Like when I was a kid, walked up to my dad, he was shaving, and I said, Daddy, I'm ready to shave. And I was only about 7 years old. He said, son, you're not ready to shave. I said, why not? He said, because this, and he showed me the razor. He said, this is a very dangerous thing in the hands of a kid. He said, when it comes time, I will show you how to do it, but you've got to be ready for this. It's the same way with God. Before He can trust you with much, He's got to know that it doesn't mean that much to you. If He's going to trust you with success, He's got to realize that success is not all important in your life. If He's going to trust you with power, He's got to know that power is not going to take over the situation. Anybody ever met anybody, and you don't have to raise your hand, I'm raising your hand on behalf of you. But if any of you have ever met anybody that because of a promotion they changed, everything about them changed, their nature, their character, their goodness changed. Why? Because they weren't ready for what they were given. Joseph had to be ready for what he was given. Also, it's the only way He can keep us what He's made us. See, to God it wasn't about the position. To God it was about shaping Joseph into the image that Joseph needed to be. It wasn't about the authority. Yes, He would save the world through Joseph. Yes, He would turn that situation and the circumstance completely around. But he realized that he wasn't going to do all of this work to make a masterpiece in Joseph and push him out there prematurely. He waited until he felt that Joseph was ready to stay who he was in that new position. I don't believe Joseph was strutting around in a new robe, saying, look at my robe. I don't think he was, look at my headdress. I don't think he was walking around showing everybody the signet ring. Look what I am. I believe what Joseph was doing, what he did with Pharaoh. My God is good. My God is glorious. Look what God did. Because you see, when you've been through this kind of situation or circumstance, the thing that you need to walk away with more than anything is the realization, I am where I am because God put me here. I am doing what I'm doing because God enabled me to do that. Because if you don't, it will change and transform who you really are. Another thing that we need to realize that it will shape us and make us what we are, and that is the only way that he can truly receive the glory. If things become about you, then you're off track. If things become about lifting yourself up, promoting yourself, making yourself look good, getting all the applause, then you're off track. You're completely off track. What God wants to do is God wants to use you for his glory. And we see that in Joseph's life. I like what A.W. Tozer said. He said, God is looking for men, and women too, by the way, in whose hands his glory is safe, in whose hands he can trust his glory. And when we are all caught up in ourselves and caught up in what we want to do and how we want to be, that's not the glory. As we discovered along this path with Joseph, we discovered something very powerful. We discovered that Joseph actually progressed in his glory for God. When he first started about it, he didn't talk about God when he talked about the dreams. The second one, he told them, well, you know, dreams belong to God. But now he's standing before Pharaoh himself, and look at the very wording that he said. He said, so Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. The very first chance he has to say, look at me. The very first chance he had to say, I can handle this. The very first thing, all he had to really say is, yes, I can interpret a dream. Instead, he said, no, sir. I choose this moment, this day, to give God the glory and the praise and let everybody know what you see happen is not in me. It's crucial. It's very crucial. When we were seeing revival in South Carolina, I would tell my church, don't you dare go out of these doors and tell them that God's moving the way he's moving because we have such great singing. I said, don't you dare go out of this place saying because we have such great teaching or preaching. I said, don't you dare go out of this place and say because we have such great people. If people ask you what is going on, say God is up to something. I said, because when you start taking the glory, he'll quickly pull it. He's a jealous God when it comes to his glory. He'll quickly remove that situation from your life. If you want the applause, you're off track. We got to be willing to say to the Lord, everybody look at what God has done and what God is doing in our life. That's what he's working to make us, and that's the progression that is taking place in our life. We are not exalted for our fame. We're exalted for his fame. So why? Because everybody needs to know about God. Everybody needs to see God. Everybody needs to experience God. And you are a walking, talking billboard for God. And if you allow yourself to be, God will exalt you, and I believe he'll exalt you in the measure that you exalt him and that you lift him up. So the second part about this that I think is as crucial and as vital as that first part there is this fact. That this dream will bring us to our greatest reward. What is our greatest reward? God. Our greatest reward is God. Abraham heard news that Sodom and Gomorrah had been, and this is before the judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah, that Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain had been overrun by 5 kings. 5 kings equals 5 kingdoms that descended upon that place, and they overtook these cities. And they took prisoners and people away in chains. And among those prisoners was Lot. So Abraham sought God and immediately began a big family. This was a big family. Heading out to attack 5 kings and 5 kingdoms. You know what happened? God gave him those kingdoms. God gave him they won victoriously over that thing. And the king of Sodom come to him and said, may I reward you? He said, no, you're not going to give me anything. He said, what? I said, you're not going to give me anything because God blesses me. I don't need your blessing, he was saying. And then God said something to Abraham in Genesis 15:1, and I love this verse, by the way. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. I am your exceeding great reward. Not just that I am your reward, I'm your exceeding great reward. You see, Abraham had come to realize that. Abraham had come to realize that it's really not about who wins and who loses. It's about the real reward. And that real reward was God in their life. Joseph had come to realize that his greatest reward has always been with him. That as Bruce had pointed out, that greatest reward was in the prison. That greatest reward was in the pit. That greatest reward was in the prison. And it was in Potiphar's house. That greatest reward was everywhere he looked. The very presence and the very power of God was in his life. And because of that, he realized long before Pharaoh had called him out that God had put his hand upon him. That God had moved upon him and blessed him. He realized that God was always been his greatest reward. That's something that we need to recognize in our own life, long before the promise is fulfilled, long before any of this is happening. There's no blessing that's greater than the blesser. There's no miracle that's greater than the miracle worker. There's no provision greater than the provider in your life. And when you learn that, when you really truly embrace that in your life, just like Joseph did, you realize that you've always been a rich man, that you've always been a blessed man, that you've always been a man of God, that you've always been that in your life. So we need to understand that God is our greatest reward. And having his name and having his glory upon us is the greatest reward we could receive. Yes?
The fact that Joseph recognized and gave God the glory put him in a position to continue to do that, because even with everything he had been through, he had no way of knowing what was coming yet. He still had to stay in touch with God, and to be the caretaker of all this food, of all these people, the records keeper of who got what, where it was stored, and that kind of stuff. Not taking away from Joseph, but he was still a shepherd boy and had been a prisoner. He was still learning, and the only place he knew to turn to was God.
That's right. That's right. And the really neat thing is, you've heard people say, I like that person because they knew where they came from. That simply meant that their character and their nature didn't change, because they still value what they've always valued. They still trust what they always trust. They still have that. That's exactly what we see in Joseph's life. I read a book. One of my favorite writers his name is Cornwell. And I love his stuff. He's so very biblical and so very studious. And he was raised in a pastor's home, in a Pentecostal pastor's home in the northwestern part of the country. And he said he saw some of the greatest men and women of God of that era walk through early in the 1900s, walk through his house and sit at the table. He said, you know what I remember about each of them? How very real they were. He said there wasn't any put on, there wasn't any, they didn't have an entourage, they didn't have people opening doors for them, they didn't have any of those things. They were just real, average, everyday people. He said when you talk with them, you found out they had been through some pain. They'd been through some struggles. They'd been through some situations. And God had always been there for them. And the more they appreciated that, and the more they honored that, the more they just wanted to tell people about this same Jesus, this same Lord, this same God. And in time, it exalted them, but it didn't change them. It changed their position. It didn't change their heart, because God had already done that. God had already moved upon them. And also, Joseph realized that God has not just been with me, but he's been orchestrating everything all along. And that's one of the most powerful things. My favorite verse, can anybody figure out what my favorite verse in the life of Joseph is? It's everybody's favorite verse, isn't it? And that's Genesis 50 and verse 20, where he tells his brothers this. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive. Joseph had a very different perspective of his life because of what he had been through. He had a very different perspective. He even seen what people had done him wrong as in God's plan. He even seen people who wished to kill him as part of God's plan. He even saw where he'd been mishandled and mistreated and thrown into prison and cheated and lied about that he was there. You see, he said it's all a part of God's plan. You notice something that you never see in Joseph's life? Revenge. Joseph was now over Potiphar and his wife. Joseph was now handed the cup by the man who had forgotten him in the prison. Joseph had the ability and the wherewithal to get revenge on them. And when his brothers would show up, he would have an opportunity to have revenge on them. But he understood something. He said, that's out of my hands because that's all part of God's doing. It was ultimately a blessing in my life for even the very worst things that happened in my life. Why? Because God was working together for the good. All things according to his purpose and according to his plan. God was working it out. God was weaving it in the background of what he had in our life. Even his heartache and his pain brought him back to the very same thing. God's been in it all the while. Now, somebody else noticed this. It was the Pharaoh. Notice what Joseph told him to start with. He said, this not coming from me, but God is telling it. But Joseph uses a name for God that was specific. He said, Elohim is giving you this. And notice what Pharaoh says back to him a little later. He said, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a man as this? A man in whom is the spirit of Elohim. He wasn't talking gods in general. He wasn't talking about some dog-headed god that they bowed to there. He used the very same word that Joseph had used to him to talk about God. He said, I don't want just anybody. I don't want just any gods. I don't want just any spirits. Give me that same spirit, that same God of the very man that was standing in front of me. So it shouldn't surprise us that he turned around and said, Joseph, you're the man. I never met a man that had his spirit. I never met a man that had the power and the glory of God upon him like you do. And he saw in a matter of seconds. Some people's a very good judge of character. He saw in a matter of seconds that he could trust this man with everything that he had. That he could trust this man with a signet ring. What was a signet ring in those times? A signet ring was the signature of the king. If he had a decree and it bore the mark, and they put wax mold down there and it was pressed in with that signet ring, that was the same as saying in the authority and the honor of the Pharaoh himself. He didn't have to get approval. He didn't have to jump through hoops. He didn't have to have any kind of senate to speak of those things. He had the authority to use the very name of Pharaoh himself. God was working this out. Elohim was working it out. When you let God make you who he wants you to be, you're not going to shine. He's going to shine through you. Everybody's going to see him. Everybody's going to know him. Everybody's going to walk away and say, not say what a wonderful person as much as what a wonderful God they serve. That's what we need in our life. And when we allow God when we recognize that and we allow God to make that happen in our life, then that's a wonderful truth. So that's what takes place in our lives when the dream finally arrives to us and finally gets to us. It doesn't mean as much to us. Why? Because God has taken the place of that dream in your heart. God who has moved in, and he's the most glorious thing that you ever know. So you're being made and shaped and prepared until the dream is secondary to who your exceedingly great reward is, and that's God. So that when he brings the dream, it doesn't change you. You've already been changed by the very grace of God. But there's something else that we need to notice, and that is the third point. It will introduce us to a new dream. What do you mean? Dreamers never stop dreaming. People that are in pursuit of what God has for their life, God just adds a new dream. When Joseph finally received what God had showed him that he's going to receive, he puts him on the path of a brand new dream. He puts him on the path of, okay, you made it this far. Now I got another place for it. I got a greater thing for you to do. Moses, what was his dream when he went into Pharaoh? God said, let my people go. What happened when Pharaoh let his people go? Moses said, well, guys, my work is done here. I'm going back to the sheep. You know, y'all. No. The next dream that he had was to take them to the promised land. It didn't work out because of their own disobedience and their own resistance of God's plan. But God had another plan in store, another dream in store, so that Moses. But when Moses hit this level, God was ready to take him to this level. It's the same way with Joseph. God turned around and gave him another dream. And the one thing we need to realize is that it was another's dream. Not just another dream, but this dream belonged to someone else. Who did this dream belong to? Who had the dream? Pharaoh. Joseph would, for the next 14 years, be fulfilling the dream of Pharaoh. He knew it was a God-given dream. He knew it was God's plan. He knew it was what God wanted, but he was fulfilling it on behalf of Pharaoh in his life. Don't be surprised is when God gives you a dream that it relies on other people, that it relies on somebody else. God's dream is for the world. God's dream is for each and every one of us. That's why I have a problem with people who have dreams and it's outside the church. I'm not talking about a church, but the church, where they're on their own and they're doing their own thing. It's like, God doesn't work that way. God's word points out that he works within the body. He works within others. And so part of our dreams oftentimes rely on working with other brothers and sisters in Christ. And sometimes it means connecting ourselves with somebody else's dream for a while, so that God's plan and God's will can be fulfilled and unfold in our life. It becomes interdependent. We begin to recognize that that's what God wants for our life. So he gave him a new dream. That new dream was another's dream. And notice what happened in verse 42. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. What did all this mean? This simply meant all that Pharaoh is, now you are. All that Pharaoh has, now you have. All that Pharaoh desires now is up to you to fulfill in this area and this dream in your life. Pharaoh would become famous in 14 years. Because he was feeding the world. Because he thought and was brilliant enough to think ahead. But it wasn't Pharaoh. It was God and Joseph saving the world. God and Joseph turning that situation around. Because you see, that's what happens in our lives when we give ourselves to God. He gives us a greater dream. He also gives us a bigger dream. When God knows that you're obedient to the call that he's given you, he entrusts you with more. Because if you're faithful in little things, he'll make you ruler over many things. So if God learns that you can be trusted with the little assignment that he's given you, you'll get a greater assignment. you get a bigger dream. This was a much bigger dream. It wasn't just one man ruling people. This was one man who was saving the world. Notice what he said. I love what he said in verse 20. When he was talking to his brothers, he said, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." What was the dream? To save the world. To be the breadbasket for the world. To take this, when in that time the civilized world was in the Mediterranean region. And all of these countries and all of these people had to rely upon this thing because God had a bigger dream, and it led to a greater focus. A focus that looked at the world around about them. Why is this significant to us? Because we've been given the same dream. To feed the world with the word of life, the bread of life. We've been given the same dream to save a dying generation. To reach out and to make an impact on the world around about us. Joseph reveals to us that if we let God shape us, and we let God mold us, and we let God make us, then he can and he will take care of that in our life. And he will bless us beyond our wildest and our greatest dreams. So he'll give us another dream. He'll give us a bigger dream. And he'll give us a greater focus in our world. You know, too often, and I realized that I learned in the business world, I called 20-year-olds the decade of discontent. Because you had all these kids coming out of college and they go into the business world and they want to be paid what you're being paid. They want to be promoted to the top of their department. All these things. And and they believe that because they have a degree, that they have all this understanding and this great, and you've got to just sit them down at times and say, "I'm sorry. You're about 10, maybe 20 years behind where you need to be because you got some processes to work through. You got some things to make it through in your life. If you will let the process take its place, yes, you'll probably be in that position. If you allow the experience to happen, yes, you'll probably be in that experience. But if we're not careful, we get on this "I want it now" fast track situation where God says, "I want to shape you," because we need to remember something. God's masterpiece is not ministry. God's masterpiece is not a great work. God's masterpiece is you. And he wants to shape you to reflect him and to bring him glory in your life. And then the great work will come. And then the great things will take place in your life. So next week, if you want to read ahead next week, the verses we will cover is the same chapter, but we're going to be looking at verses 44 through 57. Verses 44 through 57. Now, don't think the story's over. Don't think because the dream arrived that it's done. Like I said, God just gave him another dream. God just planted him in another position. God just gave him another. But there's some things that he's going to reveal to us still about this dream that he had. We should be, Lord willing, this should take us to about the end of November. Then we're going to, the week of Thanksgiving, we're gonna hit the pause button like we did last year, and then start back in our Bible study in January. So we're gonna have a little over a month there break. But we should be able to wrap this up in about the next 3 weeks, actually. Well, God bless you. We appreciate you. Thanks for coming out on this rainy day. Please be safe on those slick roads.